Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where we take you inside Scottish politics. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello, welcome to the podcast. And here's Geoff Aberdein, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister Alex Salmond. Hello, Geoff.
Good morning.
And Andy Maciver, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Good morning.
Thank you both for being here. Thank you for finding us and for listening to this podcast. If this is your first time here, then subscribe and you'll get our episodes in your feed every single week. And it's that time again where I'm going to spend the next couple of weeks asking you to leave us a review as well. Ideally, you can write your comments, but in any case, if you could just tap the 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, that would be lovely. We've got a busy 11 months on the podcast, and it'd be lovely to help other people find us. Right, shall we start with our WhatsApp of the week? This is from David in Loughborough, who says, massive fan of the podcast. As someone who's lived and worked in England for the past 15 years, but still follows Scottish politics closely, I never cease to be amazed by the fact that Scottish politics is largely still framed around the issue of independence, but almost as significantly, would argue David, by a number of retail policy offers, some transformational, others little more than symbolic, first put forward by the late Alex Salmond, Geoff Aberdein, and others during the time of what I would say is still the most impactful Holyrood administration there has ever been, 2007 to 2011, he says. Amazingly, almost without exception, no mainstream parties seriously engaged with the idea of unpicking any of them. I would argue they've largely come to define devolved government, north and south of the border. For example, every time I come back up the road and drive over the Forth, I remember the then new toll booths being removed almost as soon as they were installed, and I'm reminded of Alex Salmond's political genius. So, I have a question. What could be the similarly administration-defining retail offer that a party could propose that might take them to victory in the next election? And would a Salmond-era policy need to be overturned to pay for it? Asks David. Andy, can I come to you first? Because actually, there's something in this that we'll kind of touch on a little bit later. This idea of retail politics and what parties are actually offering. What do you make of what David's saying?
Well, our YouTube viewers will realise just how aghast Geoffrey Aberdein is that you have come to me for that question when the listener has given him the credit for everything that happened under the previous administration.
Yeah. Let's go to the guy that wasn't in the SNP, who wasn't mentioned in the question. Let's go at him first. His thoughts. Brilliant.
Sometimes I think these things through.
Class act, Calum.
That was. I enjoyed that, Callum. Thanks. But I was laughing so much at Jeff's reaction, I actually didn't hear what you asked me. So you're going to have to ask me again. Apologies.
Well, in that case, Geoff, let's come to you first on this one. What administration-defining retail offer that a party could propose, and would a Salmond-era policy need to be overturned to pay for it? Geoff Aberdein.
Well, it's a very good question, and thank you for coming to me first, obviously, because it mentioned me, Calum. I think it's important to set out the context in which those policies were made. I've been asked this question quite a lot, actually, recently, so it's interesting that it's come again from John in Loughborough. We were trying to evidence, as a party, that we could do things with devolution. And people may not remember this, but back in 2007, the run-up to it, there was, rightly or wrongly, or fairly or unfairly, a lot of disillusionment with Holyrood as an entity. And it largely focused on the relationship that Jack McConnell at the time had with his Labour colleagues down south, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, and people were becoming a bit fed up. And so Alex Salmond was very keen that we demonstrate that we could do things, first of all. And the policies that we chose, as John calls them, retail policies, were largely designed to beat Labour on their own territory, because we knew that to win the election you have to beat Labour where they would regard their kind of safe votes to be, on issues where their safe votes would be. So that was then. What is now is, I don't think it's a retail policy that is required. I think there's something much more transformational for the entire country. And I'll say again the words, the green industrialisation of Scotland. The opportunity ahead of us is vast. And what I would like to see Scottish Government ministers is not just talking nicely in favourable and glowing terms about the potential, is actually realising the potential. There's consent systems for our offshore wind. There is a lot of port optimisation and collaboration that's going to be needed. I'd like to be seeing them absolutely go all in on this issue, absolutely all in. And yes, be lobbyist in chief to the UK government where you need support from them, where they've got responsibility. But I think if you could turn around in 10 years' time and say we were responsible for essentially a thriving economy based on the green industrialisation of our country, that is what I would be focusing all my effort on. As Andy said before, we've won the natural jackpot for the second time. We've had oil and gas. We have this wonderful opportunity in new energy. Let's seize it.
Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I think if the question was a retail offer that might take a party to victory in the next election, I don't think we're in that territory at the moment, is the truth, to be honest with you. I think, you can see... I think the programme for government was really very instructive in a lot of ways. It was a pretty tame and safe piece of work. And I think it gave us all we needed to know about where we are in our politics at the moment, which is that you don't actually need a big policy offer. You don't need anything groundbreaking. You don't need to have any vision, really. It's more about what you're not rather than what you are. I think it's interesting that you look at the SNP's vote share, even in that poll at the weekend where they were returning 54, 55 seats, their vote share was like 30, I think 28% in the region and 33% in the list. This is not a wildly popular government. This is just a government that isn't anybody else. There's nobody else to vote for as far as the Scottish electorate is concerned. So I just think to be honest with you, not that I disagree with anything Geoff has said about what should be offered and what we should do. There's an awful lot that we could do in Scotland that would make things substantially better. I don't see anybody having any incentive to talk about any of it for this election. Hopefully, we throw the cards in the air next May and something better might come from it, and there might be a requirement to do better. But that is the fundamental problem in Scottish politics at the moment, is there isn't any requirement for anybody to do better than they already are.
Thanks both, and thank you, David. Thank you for your message. On the podcast today then, Nigel Farage visits Aberdeen and Hamilton ahead of the by-election there tomorrow. He spoke on oil and gas in Aberdeen and then seemingly avoided media on his constituency visit. More on that to come. Also, Sir Keir Starmer was in Glasgow announcing his government's strategic defence review. He also says there will be no independence referendum while he is the Prime Minister. We'll play you a bit of that interview that he's done as well this week. You can watch all of this on YouTube. Just search for Holyrood Sources for full episodes. You can find us on X and watch clips on TikTok, and subscribe to our mailing list at holyroodsources.com. And the WhatsApp number, if you would like to get in touch with your thoughts and comments and your questions and analysis. The number is 0333 404 6507. Right then, the Reform UK leader Nigel Farage stopped off in Aberdeen and in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse, the constituency this week, to pitch to Scottish voters for the first time as Reform UK's leader. In Aberdeen, he called on Westminster to drop the windfall levies on oil and gas and to cut taxes and to reduce household energy bills. In Hamilton, perhaps the most kind of attention-grabbing thing was that he dipped out of a planned appearance with journalists. Let's take his day in chronological order. Let's unpack it a little bit as we consider what he said and the impact he may have had. Geoff, shall we start in Aberdeen and what he had to say in Aberdeen, and talking about oil and gas, talking about the windfall tax? This is a solid message for people there, isn't it? For workers, for companies, for that part of the world.
Yeah, particularly given that we've had some significant job losses, and the company concerned directly blamed the windfall tax. Of course, there isn't a windfall, it hasn't been for 2 years. But what I want to talk about is actually something much more important, which I think people should understand about Reform's visit to Scotland. It was very well orchestrated. So they clearly calculated they might get some sort of a hostile reception coming into Scotland. It's happened before, and he's such a divisive figure, Nigel Farage, that it might have that. What I thought was really impressive from a political communication point of view is they had 2 defections lined up. One from a Tory councillor in Aberdeen to defect to Reform, and one in Hamilton from the Labour Party in Glasgow to Reform. They knew that was coming. They came up and went policy heavy in the morning on oil and gas. So they're trying to get the journalists to write some copy about the news lines there. They then add in the defections. So they're creating a number of news lines before you even get to the constituency concerned in terms of the by-election. And I thought it was a great exercise in trying to ensure you got maximum value from a visit. Now, compare and contrast that with the recent visit to the constituency of Angela Rayner. She turned up with nothing particularly to say and got completely hijacked. There was a protest, and then hijacked by Conor Gillies of Sky, who kept repeatedly asking her about the two-child cap benefit payment, because she didn't have something to say and to at least hook her visit around. And so the perception across the commentariat and the media is that they're all at sea, whereas at least Nigel Farage, despite the accusations of him not being around and available for press in Hamilton, there's already copy written up and down the country. The point I'm making here is these guys mean business. They mean business. Whether you agree with them or not, they've got a plan in place and they're executing it. I'll tell you something. One thing the late Alex Salmond used to say to me and to Kevin Pringle, his Director of Communications, is, before I do anything, what is my line, Geoff? What's my line? What are we going on? And how are we going to make sure that that comes out? Whatever happens during any visit, that comes out at the end of the day. And so I was quite impressed by that, actually, from a political communication point of view.
Andy, were you similarly impressed? Was it a kind of slick performance?
I take a slightly different view, only slightly, but I think there's been a bit of a strategic misstep from Reform in the last couple of weeks, actually. And I think what you saw on that visit, or specifically what you see in these two areas, are the two halves of Reform. So I think all the Aberdeen stuff, oil and gas stuff, windfall tax, that's all perfectly smart. It's really good territory for Nigel Farage to go on. He knows it resonates not only in the North East but everywhere else as well. Scepticism towards net zero resonates, whether we agree with it or not, it resonates. Scepticism towards wokery resonates, and scepticism is, generally what is driving votes here. However, I do think he's made mistakes in Hamilton, specifically surrounding the stuff with Anas Sarwar and the ad. I think you're getting to the point where, we're seeing a Labour councillor and a Tory councillor defecting to Reform. We've had a couple of Reform individuals on this podcast. They sound very normal. They sound very centrist. They sound very mainstream. And that ultimately, if you want to lift yourself to the next level where you are able to get 16, 17, 18 seats in the Parliament, you do need to be seen as being something around the mainstream, not in a negative sense, but you need to be seen as being acceptable. Voters need permission to vote for a party like Reform. And that's what Farage does when he starts talking about things like net zero and oil and gas. He gets himself into mainstream arguments and he gets permission. When he then starts doing things like the Anas Sarwar ad, I think that's strategically the wrong thing to do. It might work in a narrow sense in that constituency, because there is probably some appetite for it in that constituency. But I think in a wider sense ahead of the next election, I think that turns some people away who otherwise might consider voting for Reform.
Andy, but that's not disagreeing with me at all. I mean, I totally agree with you on the advert. I made my comments on that last week. I was talking about the visit north and how it was executed, and that was a proper politically from a political communication point of view. It was very well executed. They knew that they were going to have a hostile response. They knew that there was going to be some controversy. They front-loaded it with policy and then defections, and so they know that at the very worst they're going to come out of that with a score draw. Compare and contrast that with Labour, like I said. It was a very good visit. The stuff on Anas Sarwar couldn't agree more, but that's not disagreeing with what I'm saying, surely.
Well, OK, well, in that case, let's also come together on something else, Geoffrey, which is that one of the big benefits that Reform have had. I mean, yes, of course, Reform are not going to win this by-election, and yet they are the story of the by-election. But that's partly because of them, but that is, of course, also partly because of John Swinney. John Swinney has also made Reform the story of this by-election. And that suits the SNP very well, because we know that the only party in Scotland that isn't losing any votes to Reform is the SNP. They're not losing anything to Reform. Their biggest danger is folks staying at home, not folks switching to Reform. So, to be fair, from Swinney's point of view, making Farage front and centre of this argument, which has helped the Reform cause as well because it's fuelled all the interest in them, that is as much to do with John Swinney as it is to do with Nigel Farage, don't you think?
Yeah, I do. John and Chris Musson said this last week. I mean, he's leaning into this to try and garner greater support for his own party. But I think there's risk there. Let's wait and see what the result is on Thursday to see just how well or otherwise Reform do. But I think John Swinney playing an anti-Reform card in a by-election is one thing. Playing it at a Holyrood election in large in less than a year's time won't work to the same degree, in my opinion, because, as you've rightly pointed out earlier on this conversation, that people are not exactly over-enamoured with the SNP in government right now. And if you try and present yourself as the antithesis of Reform, as your sole campaigning rhetoric going into an election, the result will not be guaranteed. I'm going to just say this. I don't know what happens on Thursday, but I've seen enough from Reform to suggest that they could actually mount a serious challenge in 2026. As things stand, a lot can change, obviously. And I just think it's complacency in the extreme for John to dine out on an anti-Reform agenda. He needs to do a lot more himself, and his government needs to do a lot more in terms of improving their standing in Scottish political discourse.
Can I just feed into this then? The response, one of the responses from one Scottish Labour MSP, this is Monica Lennon, who's Labour MSP for Central Scotland, on news that Councillor Jamie Maguire defected from Scottish Labour to become the Reform UK councillor for Renfrew North and Bray Head. You mentioned the Conservative councillor in Aberdeen, Duncan Massey, who also defected. But just by way of Monica Lennon's response, she posted a shameful defection to the far right motivated by personal ambition. Reform UK supporters are polluting Hamilton Town Centre today with their appalling racism, lies and hate. Reform and Farage won't win here. It's not a particularly constructive response, I suppose, is my initial take, Geoff.
Yeah, because I want to link to what I just said. There was a bit amiss from what I just said, is that John Swinney's reason for being, incidentally, is that you want Scotland to become independent. On Friday morning, we'll be chewing over somewhere in the order of 20, maybe as high as 25% of that electorate voting in Hamilton, voting for Reform. Now, if you juxtapose that next to Monica Lennon's comments, suddenly when you're talking about a party being fascist and racist and all the rest of it, what about the voters that voted for them? That's your fellow Scots. That's your electorate. And this is where I think both the SNP and Labour have to be very, very careful moving forward. Because if you just throw away comments like that, insults, all the rest of it, some of it might be justified. That's not the point. The point is that people are clearly voting for Reform. And you need to tackle them on the substance, not on the spin. And finally, if John wants Scotland to be an independent country, he's going to have to speak to these voters. So calling them fascists and racist and all the rest of it is not going to get you anywhere. Very fast.
Andy, what do you make of Monica Lennon's response? And is it exactly that? I mean, I'm looking at it again now. She quote tweets the Reform UK Scotland Post welcoming former Scottish Labour councillor Jamie Maguire. She says he is motivated by personal ambition. It's a shameful defection. And on the supporters' point, she uses language like polluting Hamilton Town Centre with appalling racism, lies and hate.
Well, I totally agree with what Geoff said. I think, look, politicians, both SNP and Labour politicians, but particularly Labour politicians at the moment, because they're the ones who are suffering, are delivering, I mean, in many cases, responses from the heart, I suppose. They're pretty hurt by what's gone on over the last year or so. They're a bit discombobulated, I think, by what's gone on over the last year or so, and it's pretty easy to react in that way. I don't think Monica's reacted in that way for any malicious sort of reasons. But Labour people are really hurt by what's going on. But I think fundamentally, they're just not really properly understanding why this has happened to Labour. And I do again, some of the language, as Geoff has said, you're getting pretty far away from criticising the switcher, the guy who's defected, and into criticising people who are going to cross the box on Thursday for Reform, who less than 1 year ago almost certainly voted for the Labour Party. That's the real risk for Labour people in particular criticising them. I totally agree with what Geoff said about John Swinney criticising them. I think that's dangerous territory, especially when you come into next May. But for Labour to criticise these people, they're criticising people who voted for their own party less than 1 year ago. I think they need to spend more time working out why, rather than criticising them for doing it.
I just think it's really important to clarify that we're not saying that John Swinney and Monica Lennon and others are calling the voters these names, right? We're not saying that now, but once you have this by-election result in the bag and then you see that a good chunk of that electorate have, suddenly those voters think, well, I'm not those things, why would you call me that? And I think that's very careful, and that's where you've got to balance these things. And I thought John Swinney, in fairness to him, tweeted something that I think I sent on to you guys that I think was much more in the territory where you should be. He was going on policies, winter fuel, we restored it. Child payment, we'll mitigate all this, and that's on the substance of stuff that you're trying to produce on your record. And then with reform, what you have to do is say, right, okay, let's take your top greatest hits on net zero nonsense, on immigration, and meet them in the middle and say, right, actually, we recognise that some people are feeling the pain of this net zero, acceleration net zero, but we must get there. But let's do it in a more balanced and pragmatic way. And I think there is massive kudos to the political party to get to that position very quickly in terms of trying to usurp reform and halt their charge just now. It just seems to be that they're shouting at them. They're terrible, you're terrible, you're terrible. But actually there's a reason people are voting for them. So look at the substance of the reasons why they're voting for them and take them on the substance. I keep saying that. Because I think they'd be struggling pretty hard if you with a very kind of nascent party, they haven't got the infrastructure in place that the other parties do. If you start taking them on this, okay, right, let's have a chat about this. Let's have a debate about this and find a way to explain in very simple terms why their position's wrong and your position's more balanced and pragmatic. Right now, we're being pushed into extremes.
This is why the ad was a mistake.
I agree.
Because you don't want to give Labour and if Labour and the SNP want to criticise reform for being extreme, if you're reform, you want to make them look as ridiculous as possible when they say those things.
I agree, yeah.
Doing that ad gives legitimacy to what the SNP and Labour say, rather than to what reform say. That's why it was a big strategic error, I think.
Just on the John Swinney post, just for info, so he posted, Farage has no solutions for working people. He would cut Scotland's budget while the SNP is putting your priorities first, scrapping peak rail fares, delivering more NHS appointments, restoring winter fuel payments. John Swinney says vote SNP to stop Farage and for a better Scotland. Just for info. Just while we're talking about the by-election as well, I do think we should play you one of the kind of media moments of the week. This is the somewhat elusive Labour candidate in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse. He's David Russell, and here's his encounter with STV's Colin Mackay.
You're probably speaking to quite a lot of older people. Are you getting any anger from them that Labour have scrapped their winter fuel allowance?
Yes, there is
what do you
some
say
concern.
To them?
Well, there's some concern, and Scottish Labour have said from day one that we will reinstate the winter fuel allowance.
But at Westminster you've scrapped it, so again you'd have to mitigate what your government did at Westminster.
But there were hard decisions to be made when the Labour government came into power in Westminster. There was a.
So you think they were right to scrap it?
There was a 20
Do you think they were right to scrap it?
There was a 20
Do you
billion
think they were right to scrap it?
black hole.
Do you think they were right to scrap the winter fuel payment for pensioners?
There were hard decisions to take.
Do you think they were right?
Well, there were very hard decisions to take.
Do you think they were right to do it? It was a hard decision. Do you think they made the right decision?
Well, they took it based on the decisions, the circumstances they'd inherited.
So you backed them? You backed the Chancellor, you backed the Prime Minister on it?
They had very hard decisions to make.
And you backed them?
I totally think that the decisions they had to make were based on the previous government's mismanagement of the country.
And you backed them on it?
On the doorsteps here, people are...
Yeah, but you back the government. You back the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. You can just tell me yes or no.
Well, I wasn't involved in the decision, and this is a Scottish Parliament election, right? If I was a member of Parliament then, I would have based it on the facts I had in front of me at the time.
That's Davy Russell with Colin Mackay. Andy, that's one of those interviews where you almost start feeling sorry for a politician. Almost.
Well, I generally try not to, because they've decided to put themselves in this position.
I agree. I entirely agree.
There's a lot to say about that. I think, look, I want to be fair first. This guy has obviously not had much exposure to interviews and that sort of thing, and interviews can make you look worse than you are, because not everybody is particularly good in that sort of medium and all that sort of stuff. So I want to sort of put that caveat over. But, if you're the Labour Party, I'm sorry, you've got a by-election coming up that you know is going to be really, really big news. And this is not a council by-election, this is a parliamentary by-election. And you know this is going to be big news, and you know that your candidate is going to have to be front and centre of national politics whenever they're called upon. You've got to intervene and make sure an appropriate candidate is chosen for that job. Now, I'm sure that there'll be all sorts of chat about this with a local decision and a local constituency association and all that sort of stuff. I'm sorry, this is a bigger issue here. You're less than a year out from an election that you're supposed to be winning, let's not forget. You're supposed to be, on the way to becoming First Minister and getting people into that Parliament who can sit in Cabinet and do Cabinet jobs and do big and important things. You've got to take control of these situations and make sure that you have got people in your parliamentary group, and you've got candidates who are able to do this. And I'm afraid, for whatever the reason is, whether it's his abilities or whether it's simply his interview technique or whatever it might be, and I'm trying to be as kind as possible here, this is not acceptable from the point of view of the Labour Party. And I'll tell you something else. Devolution has a problem at the moment amongst the people out there in the country, a big problem. Devolution is not well regarded. Politicians are not well regarded. This is why we saw in our poll last year 20% of people want the Parliament scrapped. It used to only be 10, it's now 20. I'm afraid it's good fun to listen to these interviews, right? And that's fine. It does not do devolution any good at all. It's very damaging for the devolution brand, because people will look at that and they'll say, oh my God, another one. I mean, what is going on here? What is wrong with these people? Let's get rid of this thing. It's not good, guys.
Yeah. Is it fair to say, Geoff, that Labour has already had a shocker of a by-election regardless of what the result is? This has been a shambles from start to finish.
Leading the questioner, eh? I think Andy's most salient point is that they knew this by-election, the moment the tragic death of Christine McKelvey, they knew that this by-election was going to happen. At that point, not preparing the ground for the territory that you want to fight on in a policy sense, not preparing the candidate in a manner in which they can deal with these things. Now, I accept what Andy says. The intricacies of internal party politics is such that maybe Davy Russell just had to be the candidate. Therefore, why has he not been media trained within an inch of his life? Because, as Andy rightly says, you're going to have the national spotlight on you, and these moments are going to happen. And that question's not a difficult one to answer, guys, because we know that the UK government have all accepted the premise that they were going to try and nullify the winter fuel payments. So you just say, no, I don't back them on it, and I wouldn't have backed this at the time, and I'm glad that we're looking at efforts to ameliorate this policy. End of story. So it doesn't augur well. But I'm going to say something else, perhaps to be a bit more balanced on this and not just anti the Labour candidate. I've not been impressed with any of the candidates. I watched STV. I think it's a poor fare, and I think, again, Andy's point's right. Are we attracting the right talent? Have we got the right systems in place to promote people to our national parliament? Because I'm not seeing much there, and it's nice people, good people, solid people. I get that, but Yes, what is politics? It's ability to convey and communicate your priorities, the priorities that you have, one for your constituency and indeed your party has for the country. But if you cannot communicate them to a level where your audience, the electorate, can understand them, then you really aren't off to a winner at all. And so I just feel the whole thing, frankly, I think the whole campaign's been pretty dreary from all sides, in all honesty. I think reform makes it interesting. If you didn't have a reform charge, I think this would be one of the most uninspiring, boring by-elections in modern history, to be honest with you.
Yeah, fair. I should just say that we're going to put a list of all the candidates in this by-election in the description of this podcast episode, so you can have a little browse of that. Quick one on this, from Jamie on email, who says, I've been listening on the by-election, and I was wondering your thoughts. If Labour come third and Reform in second, is it time up for Anas Sarwar, is Jamie's question. Now, bearing in mind there's 11 months to go till the Holyrood election, that's the kind of context of this by-election. He certainly would come under pressure, though, wouldn't he, Geoff? I mean, there would be real questions for Sarwar if Labour in third.
Well, just so people understand, I mean, as people maybe know, I like a flutter now and then. Oh, by the way, I'm at the Perth races for the Gold Cup this Sunday. Send me your tips. Hi to Geoff. Send me your tips.
If you're there.
I've looked at the bookies since the start of this contest. Would you believe that when the contest was first announced, Labour were favourites? Wow. So I managed to get some money on the SNP at that point because I thought there was no favourites. Reform were rank outsiders, and now Reform are second favourites behind a very heavily backed SNP. So it does look, on the face of it, if the bookies are right, that Labour will come third. Does that precipitate the end of Anas Sarwar? No, it doesn't. I think there's enough mitigating circumstances around what's been happening at the UK government level to suggest that Anas won't be ladled with all the blame. That said, I think in 2026, if Anas Sarwar is not in a position to become First Minister, he will stand down. I mean, he's had a good stint as leader in terms of time, and I think he'll think that enough's enough. But I don't think I can see an argument for a Scottish Labour leader leaving 10 months before an election campaign. Just can't see it.
Yeah. Andy?
So I agree with that. I don't think so. But I do think there will be a lot of internal pressure. Funnily enough, I mean, there will be quite a big drive for Scottish Labour to turn left after the 2026 election. I think that will exist. I think it will be incredibly short-sighted to believe that it's anything to do with Scottish Labour's actual policy platform that this is happening to them. And I think that's one of the reasons why Anas Sarwar will not stand down before the election, because not a single bit of this is Anas Sarwar's fault. None of it whatsoever is Anas Sarwar's fault.
Sorry to interrupt, Andy. Yeah. Why do you think there'll be a clamouring for Labour to turn left?
Because I think there are enough MSPs in the Scottish Labour Parliamentary Party who think that if they start talking more leftist language, that will make a difference. I think it will make absolutely zero difference whatsoever. None, not one bit of difference. Because this is nothing to do with Scotland. I mean, that's the reality of it. This isn't anything to do with Scotland. This is to do with Westminster.
I find that really intriguing because there's not one bit of evidence that I can see that lurching to the left will win you an election. Not in Scotland, not in the UK.
But that is the history of the Labour Party when they are not in power, is that they search for solutions that go further left and left and left and left until they realise that nobody actually wants it. So I do think that after 2026 there will be that compulsion.
In an English local election context, that they're losing votes to Reform and also the other way, to the Greens and to the Lib Dems. That was the evidence of the local elections. So the English party, if I could put it like that, but Labour at that level are already battling with that. And the kind of vote, again, in a UK parliamentary context, there's going to be something of a battle over the welfare. The welfare vote in a couple of weeks could be a huge rebellion for Starmer.
And don't forget as well, Andy Burnham, in effect, made his leadership pitch last weekend, which was very much a kind of left turn, not a massively, but very much a left turn on these issues. And we see that is generally going to be the direction of travel for Labour, where they buckle on welfare and all that sort of thing. So I do think there will be that element of pressure, but I think I think it's unrealistic to think there'll be any pressure for Anas Sarwar to do it right now, because anybody who's putting their thinking cap on here would say to themselves, am I really going to do any better in 2026 myself? Maybe I should just wait and see what happens after that.
And also, just one point, Anas Sarwar is a good politician. He is good. I think he's grown in stature. I think he's not had his difficulties to seek. I don't think he's combated or dealt with the UK government, the Labour Party in government, as well as he could have. But he's fundamentally, I think, a good communicator, and I don't see who naturally would replace him.
Yeah. Fair, absolutely fair point. So we wait to see what comes out of the by-election. We're recording on Wednesday, by-election's Thursday, and we're going to pop into your feed on Friday morning with an immediate reaction for you as well, so look out for that. Just one more thing we want to touch on is the visit of Sir Keir Starmer to Scotland, to Glasgow specifically, in the last couple of days. He was, of course, announcing his strategic defence review. Interestingly, though, Philip got in touch over the weekend asking a question about Starmer and the Scottish Government and an independence referendum, and just sort of questioning where all of this would end up. Well, the Prime Minister was on BBC Radio Scotland yesterday. Have a listen to this.
Anas Sarwar has turned Scottish Labour around and produced incredible results with us at the general election in 2024. I remember being asked many times between 2020 and 2024 and challenged that Labour was not going to break through in the 2024 election. I always said that we would stay focused, we'll do that into 2026. But in the end, the question at that election is, do we want another term of the SNP after all these years of failure?
And if we
that
get
is the
another
central
term,
question
but if we
at
get
the election next year.
If we get another term of the SNP or a nationalist majority, is it time for another independence referendum?
Well, look, I think it's really important to focus on the priorities that matter most. We got a big election win last year on the basis that we would stabilise the economy and ensure that on that foundation we built a stronger Scotland in a stronger United Kingdom, and that's what I intend to do.
Can you imagine another independence referendum during your time at number 10?
No, and nobody's raising that with me as their first priority. Certainly in the discussions I'm having with the First Minister, that is not. We're talking about jobs, energy, security, and dealing with the cost of living crisis.
And whatever happens next year in May doesn't change any of that?
No, it's not a priority.
It's not a priority, says the Prime Minister. I suppose there's... to what level, to what extent are you surprised by what he said there, Geoff? I think, for me, the most ear-catching thing is it's not coming up in conversation with the First Minister.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, incidentally. Just let's start off with that. The not coming up in conversations, perhaps John Swinney will have to remind Keir Starmer, just in case you were wondering, I'm a nationalist and I want independence. In case you didn't know that already, Sir Keir. This is totally unsurprising, what you'd expect to hear from a unionist Prime Minister. The difficulty, I think, comes twofold, and it's for both the Labour Party and for the SNP. Firstly, for the Labour Party, there is a core independence vote out there just now. I would say core between 30 and 36, 37%, right? The recent poll that had independence at 54%, and even higher if Nigel Farage had become Prime Minister. But, that's where I think the core vote is. You're basically just saying to them, your views are irrelevant because you're not going to get a referendum. And you're turning around, again, this is the point about there's a bit of a theme coming through this podcast today. It's you're turning around to the people that you're elected to serve and saying you don't get your democratic wishes respected. That's a tricky position to be in. It's a tricky position for Anas Sarwar to be in, who actually has always sought to try and embrace independent supporters, recognising he needs them for his electoral success. The second part is the John Swinney side of things, and this is what I think is really interesting. How does he approach the next election? Pretty soon after this by-election, after the summer, he's going to have to come clean on what he wants to do on the Constitution. There are only two routes, I think, in the wake of Nicola Sturgeon, frankly, very mistakenly, in my view, going to the Supreme Court and getting the response that we all thought we'd get, is this. You can follow the Alpa Party route and say the next election is the de facto referendum, i.e. that is all about independence, or you can try and go down the route of pledging the right to choose. Do you think you have the right to choose as a voter? Whether you agree with independence or not at this stage, do you believe that you have the democratic right to choose, and try and infiltrate that into the campaign in some way? I say again, when we were in government in 2007, independence, support for independence was pretty low, but there was huge majority support for having the democratic right to choose. I think the generation has passed. You know, you used to all say, oh, it's a once in a generation. I think the generation's passed. I mean, how long is a generation? We're over 10 years now. So I think those are the two routes facing John Swinney. I think there's only two plausible ways in which you would seek to do it. And from a right to choose, if you win, you can build your campaign from there and then start talking Turkey. But it'll be interesting to see how he responds to this challenge, because people are going to be asking very soon.
Well, exactly, because part of this, Andy, is that actually the expectation a few months ago was that Scottish Labour would win in 2026, and that would remove the issue from discussion altogether. But actually, that is far from a certainty. In fact, it's not even looking likely at all for next year.
I think, yeah, I mean, look, when John Swinney came into this job, which is, just over a year ago now, he would not have, let's just remember, it seems a long time ago, but he was coming into this job so the SNP could lose gracefully. That was his gig, right?
That's right.
At that point.
That's right.
Imagine putting that on your job application. Look, guys, I want to manage the decline here, but God, I'm going to do it in a really professional way. Don't you worry about it.
That's what it was. This was a nice, graceful exit strategy for the SNP's time in government, right? That's the gig. So, not only does he get to the point where he's not losing gracefully, he's actually winning a landslide. But by the way, there is no way he would have thought to himself at that point, maybe I'm the guy to deliver independence. I mean, really, he would not have thought that, right? This is unrealistic to think that was the case. And incidentally, I still don't think the numbers are actually there for that. But it does...
Even by his own measure, incidentally, by Swinney's own measure, the numbers aren't there, because he said kind of a sustained 60%, hasn't he, recently?
Well, I mean, and then that's been said by people inside the SNP for really quite some time, actually. But and we're not there. I mean, that poll last weekend had a question saying, if Nigel Farage was Prime Minister, would you vote for independence? And it was like 58% yes, which actually I know sounds a lot, but in the context of the way the question was asked, I actually didn't think it was that high. So, but I do think it does compel John Swinney and his team to think a little bit more about the independence strategy, because, if there is any gift to the independence movement, it is an English nationalist. I've always thought for a long time, and I remember way back to when I started in politics, 20 odd years ago, David McCletchie used to say the same thing, that the biggest risk to the Union was not Scottish nationalism, it was English nationalism, and it's never really reared its head. But Nigel Farage is an English nationalist, and if he continues on the ascendancy, I think there's no question at all that is net good for the cause of Scottish nationalism. And Swinney and his team are absolutely compelled to think about their strategy in that context, I think.
There's a couple of thoughts when you were speaking there. We were all told that if the unthinkable happened, and Boris Johnson were to become Prime Minister, that would be it. We would be independent very quickly. I don't put as much store in this stuff as
and we were told the same for Brexit as well, of course. And it never quite happens. So I do think
Andy,
that's a good point.
The critical thing you're missing there is I wasn't around anymore. Had we been there, Scotland would be flying high as an independent country, I'm sure. No, I know. I think the interesting thing here is, what is the reform position on the Constitution? If Nigel Farage is, as you describe him, an English nationalist, what does he care about Scotland anyway? And so, I mean, if he really wanted to rise to prominence in a Holyrood election context, and that would be a bit of a tough one for the SNP to argue against, wouldn't it? Say, you can have your referendum, no bother. And what did the SNP say to that?
Well, he did say this week, didn't he, Farage? He said, devolution's here to stay, but it's not worked very well over the last 20 years, is how he's kind of framed it.
Oh, and I think Geoff has made a very interesting point there. Yeah. If you compare somebody like Nigel Farage to, let's say, somebody like Theresa May, okay? Theresa May is an absolute British nationalist, an absolute unionist, and who genuinely, if you look at what she was doing through Brexit negotiations, her biggest worry, for instance, through the Brexit negotiations was Northern Ireland. That was always top of her list of concerns. And she's thought the same things about Scotland as well. I think that's fundamentally where you have to understand the different sort of person Nigel Farage is. If Scotland had voted for independence in 2014, would Nigel Farage have woken up the next day sad and upset about life? No, he wouldn't have cared. He wouldn't have, and that's not a criticism. He's an English nationalist. There's nothing wrong with being an English nationalist. It's fine, but that is what he is. And I do think it's I think it's very interesting to think about how you could negotiate with Nigel Farage on the case for a Scottish independence referendum. I tell you something, he'd think about it more than Keir Starmer would.
Yeah. So the SNP's position is, vote SNP 1, Reform 2.
Absolutely.
Music to Kenny McCaskill's ears.
Could you imagine? Yeah. Voters for a Scottish National Party and an English National Party at the same election. Brilliant.
I can see John and Nigel on the steps of Butte House, and the tweet goes out saying, "This is a man I can work with."
Yeah.
Goodness. I mean, imagine. That would just be astonishing. Right, thank you both very much.
Do you know sometimes, right, it's conversations like this that you realise we are such geeks. Oh my God, like getting excited about this sort of chat.
Jeff, we're still recording, Jeff.
Yeah. All right.
That's what we're here for. That's what we're here for. And I'm certain that as you listen to this, you are laughing along and thinking you're a geek as well. Jeff and Andy, geeks in peace, thank you very much. So yes, we're going to drop back into your feed Friday morning with some reaction to the by-election result, which we'll have by then. So all of this talk will have a conclusion. Join us then. Leave us a review on the app you're listening. Thank you so much for being with us. And yeah, we'll talk to you again on Friday morning.